Hello everyone, it's Old Guardian here. As you may know, I have built a lot of Hearthstone budget decks, and I'm often asked, okay, well, I would have enough dust to make like one legendary. How could I make this deck better? But the answer to that question is often not very easy, because when I build a budget deck that is completely without epic or legendary cards, I have to try to build all the synergies for the deck, just so that it just works, everything works perfectly together. And then you can't just typically switch out one card and put in another card, and the deck would be better like that. So upgrading a deck is not always a simple task. However, I went through and scored lots of Hearthstone statistics in an attempt to find something in between. So in this video I'm going to present the top 4 cheap decks. And these are cheap decks. These are full cost decks, these are full power decks, these are no means budget decks. These are designed to be working as they are, and they are capable of climbing. So are of course many budget decks, but it's more work when you're on a budget. But if you're pretty low on dust but you can do a legendary or two, then what kind of decks should you be looking at? Coming in at number 4 is the hybrid Murloc Shaman. So this deck is a crossover between the Aggro Overload Shaman, which makes extensive use of Doomhammer to swing face, as well as Thunderhead, perhaps the best Shaman card in existence, in order to get a lot of tokens and take over the board. This hybrid deck doesn't use Doomhammer, it uses Murloc package instead. So you have Murlocs, you have Thunderhead, you have Overload spells, you just build a lot of tokens. And then those tokens hit face with Bloodlust. And there is a Storm Chaser that can help you tutor for your Bloodlusts. It's a fairly inexpensive build, coming in at 3520 dust, and the only really expensive cards that you need to craft for it are the 2 copies of Thunderhead. And Thunderhead is a good card to craft, because Thunderhead is perhaps the best Shaman card right now, so almost any Shaman deck that you may want to play, you almost always want to put Thunderhead in it, so excellent card to craft. And then there's Murloc War Leader. And also, if you want to play with Murlocs, well, Murloc War Leader is the first card that you want to craft, if you want to play with Murlocs with any class. So I'm trying to find these positions where you're going to craft cards that potentially have uses outside of these decks as well. So not crafting too many single-use cards. And for those purposes, this one is a definite match. Coming in at number 3 is Midrange Hunter. And Midrange Hunter is just naturally cheap, because for this deck, 2 copies of Master's Call, it's an epic, and 1 copy of Zul'jin, that's a legendary. That's all the expensive cards you need. But you can't really build this so comfortably on a budget, because if you try to build a budget Midrange Hunter and think, okay, I'm going to upgrade this later, well, if you don't have Master's Call, then you probably don't want to run a full beast build. So you probably don't want to put stuff like Timberwolves in the deck. You're not going to get nearly as much value from putting in Scalehide and Dire Frenzy in the deck. Just, you want to build it differently. You want to build it with Houndmasters if you want to build it really on a budget. And likewise, if you don't have Zul'jin, then Unleash the Beast is not nearly as useful, Dire Frenzy is not nearly as useful, you just lose a lot of value. So again, you want to build a different type of deck. So that's why it's hard to say, okay, first build a budget Midrange Hunter and then upgrade into this. Because this one really is as cheap as it gets when you use this strategy. One of the main upsides of this build is that this sort of Midrange Hunter is one of the best decks against Warrior right now, and Warrior is pretty common on the ladder. So there's a very cheap Warrior counter coming in at just 3360 dust. The weakness of this deck is that it's pretty weak against aggressive strategies, rogues, also maybe 2 Warlock token Druid. They're not as bad as rogue, but they can still be pretty bad. So the deck is a hunter deck, but it's not a really fast hunter deck, and sometimes that can be a liability. Still, a very sweet deck to climb if you're facing some of these greedier, slower, very expensive decks. So haha, they have these 12,000 dust decks, but this 3,000 dust deck is actually a pretty good counter to those. Coming in at number 2 is Bomb Hunter. Bomb Hunter just is a very strong archetype. I've chosen a build here without Boommaster Flag, because Boommaster Flag is a very single-use legendary. You can basically only use it in Bomb Hunter, and that's kind of the stuff that we want to avoid if we want to craft cheap decks. We want to try to maximize the value we have from our dust. And while this deck nominally costs 6400 dust, there's actually a Snip Snap in this deck, so you can take 1600 away from that because Snip Snap is going to be available for free for another week and a half after the publishing of this video. So it's really only 4800 dust, and that 4800 dust largely goes into Leroy Jenkins and Ziliax. And these two legendaries are really cards that you want to craft anyway. You want to use them in lots of different decks, they are neutrals, they are great. So in practice this kind of Bomb Hunter build comes in very cheap. This has similar strengths and weaknesses as Midrange Hunter. Some of the faster, wide aggro decks can be challenging for this. This is really good against warriors, although not quite as good as Midrange Hunter. And also, this one is pretty good against Midrange Hunter. Hunter is just a strong budget option. Finally, coming in at number 1 is Token Druid. Even the budget Token Druid is really strong, and Token Druid is a pretty cheap deck to upgrade as well. The nominal cost of this deck 4400 dust, but there's again Snip Snap, so it's actually just 2800. And it's really just 4 epics. There's 2 copies of Whispering Woods, and that is a single use card, I admit. Whispering Woods cannot be used in any other archetype except for Token Druid, but that's just 2 epics, that's half a legendary, so I think that's a sacrifice that can be made. And then there are 2 copies of Sea Giant, and Sea Giant again is a card that can be used in several decks. If you sometimes want to build like a Cyclone Mage, if you want to build some of those rogue builds that use Sea Giant. Very multi-use card. For this cheap builds video, I intentionally chose a deck that does not run Keeper Steladris. I love Keeper Steladris in this deck. But if you want to keep it cheap, you want to avoid crafting those Druid class legendaries. Same with War Druid Lottie and Flopidinous Floop, which also see play in some of the decks of this archetype. And this sort of Token Druid is really good at taking on Hunters, it's good at taking on Murloc Shamans. It's mediocre against Warrior, but it's pretty close to a 50-50 matchup. So even though Warrior is not something that you can really target with this, you don't feel too bad about going against Warrior either. And Warrior matchup is something that I am really thinking about right now in the current meta, with Warrior constantly becoming more and more popular. You can of course question, okay, that's just 4 decks, what about everything else? Well, I did look at a lot of other decks too, and Zoo Warlock and Aggro Overload Shaman are decks that have pretty good performance at times. I did not include either of them in this one. Both of them have a pretty terrible matchup against Warrior, and I'm really concerned about that matchup in particular. The number 4 pick, the Hybrid Murloc Shaman, it's also unfavored against Warrior, but not quite as badly as those 2. Then looking at Rogue and Paladin decks, then both of those really require multiple expensive class legendaries that cannot be used in anywhere else. Sure, like crafting Heistbaron Togwaggle, Myra's Unstable Element, Edwin Van Cleave. Okay, I guess that's kind of acceptable, but then you also still need Leroy, and now we're getting into very expensive territory. Or with Paladin, you can either go the Kangor's route, or then you can go with Hoderat Paladin with Shirvala, Crystalspit Kangor, and Prismatic Lenses. Either way, some fairly expensive cards, and cards that cannot really be used in any other archetype. So that's why I can't recommend them as top cheap decks. Then there's Mage and Warrior, and all the decks that Mage and Warrior use right now are very expensive, so they are not really options. And finally there is Priest, but with Mind Blast going to Hall of Fame, and that change can happen any day now. They haven't given us a date, they've only said that it's going to happen when the next patch is coming. And I think that change is probably going to kill Silence Priest. I do like Silence Priest, but it might have like 1 day to live. Maybe. After this video is out, I just don't know, so I can't recommend that, and I can't recommend any other Priest decks either. But if you're looking to move up from a budget build into something a little bit more full cost and full power, then these 4 decks, Murloc Shaman, Midrange Hunter, Bomb Hunter, Token Druid, should be able to serve you well. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the show, please click the like button and subscribe to my channel for more.